Hi, I want to talk for a moment about this upcoming government shutdown we might have, about Planned Parenthood, driven by the more dogmatic and extremist wing of the Republican Party. And I want to talk about morality for a second as well, moral posturing, and what is so fundamentally wrong and backward about this whole situation, and what is just intrinsically is fundamentally flawed and deeply troubling about the current state of the Republican Party and our current political discourse, which does not speak to most Americans, probably not even to most self-described conservatives. The first thing is, no matter where someone stands on abortion, the idea behind this shutdown is that Planned Parenthood is essentially endorsing and conducting abortion, and that this is a problem, and that, among other things, recent controversy about Planned Parenthood, that this is a top moral priority, and that it warrants the shutdown of a government to include services to millions of Americans, including the elderly, people's parents and grandparents who rely on the continuation of certain services, people that are currently subsidized in one form or another, including working poor, people raising families. This affects people that need to get passports for travel, be it personal or professional. I've seen the effect this can have, and it's absolutely terrifying and disheartening and infuriating. And this does not affect the majority, if any, of the Republicans in Congress, or the Democrats for that matter. These people are fine at the end of the day no matter what. Their family, their extended family, and their friends, and anyone they deeply care about is protected. The majority of them are millionaires. They're all getting gold-plated services for health care and other things by proxy of even being in Congress, whether they do their job or not. And keep in mind, this shutdown at least the last shutdown, I think it was 2 years ago, affected veterans, including people I've served with in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially in Iraq. And these veterans were people that legitimately were receiving benefits from the VA, waiting on benefits, disability-related for the most part, emergency services for things like, paying rent and stuff like that. Veterans were affected by this shutdown, and luckily it didn't last for too long. And I remember working with people that helped after Sandy, the superstorm, with recovery, that looked at the way we got emergency aid and relief to some of the victims through something called horizontal integration. We would crowdsource it, crowdfund it, put it on a website, and we would source this stuff out directly through churches and other conduits of connection within the community, points of connection and relationship, and these different nodes of dissemination, most notably the churches and the nonprofits. I was doing this in Coney Island as well as Red Hook and other places, working with these volunteer-based, self-organizing grassroots movements like Occupy Sandy, which was not even political. It was predominantly a relief effort, ground up, and it got people what they needed. So we try to organize this for veterans, just to react to the mess made by this government shutdown. Meanwhile, you have these completely self-serving politicians hiding behind the facade of morality and caring genuinely about values, quoting the Bible, talking about how much they care about the unborn. And I'm sure some of them do. And I think all of us agree that a fully cognitive human being, whether they're born or not, is important. I'm not saying that it is not an important issue. But the idea, the very premise that they're doing this out of some higher principle, out of concern for human flourishing or the well-being of sentient creatures, most notably of humans, is absolutely absurd. And it is absurd at its very core, and I'll explain why. If you look at this, if they really care, if these Republicans really care about human life, if they care about the unborn, let's just take the unborn. Let's not even talk about people that are alive. That's a whole other problem set. Let's talk about the unborn. If they really care, they will be open enough to look at the studies, look at the science, look at the decades of evidence and the corollaries between, and the causal relationships between abortion and things like poverty, things like education, literacy, contraception. There's usually not a causal straight line without multiple variables being involved. There's usually not a completely neat, clear relationship here. In social science, we have to look at multiple variables. But in general, there is a correlation between poverty, ignorance, lack of education, recidivism, crime, mass incarceration, things like that, things that have been problematic for decades, that all these Republicans have known about, as well as the Democrats, and for the most part have not done anything about. Very little. The Republicans have barely paid lip service to these problems with our justice system. The Democrats have pretended to care, mainly out of lip service to black community and liberal reformers, and they pretend to care about those issues. The Republicans barely, until recently, have barely even talked about it, with some good exceptions. So if you really care about abortion, and if you really cherish human life, and that is your overriding priority, to the point where you will shut down the government and affect millions of Americans who did nothing to deserve this, if it is that important to you, then you will look at the science, you will look at the facts and evidence, and you will start to take it more seriously. And you will start to look at prison reform, drug reform, look at the alternative methods of community justice. You will look at ways that can help communities flourish, including policies that actually get the government out of the way and allow for better employment and economic opportunity among residents. Locking someone up and incarcerating them and giving them a criminal record for decades after their offense simply for having marijuana on them or smoking a joint on the street, you're criminalizing that kind of behavior. Their ability to get certain jobs is just undeniably tainted for sometimes decades after the fact. And you don't even care how this affects people's lives economically or how it affects poverty and crime in the aggregate. It makes things worse. It leads to more recidivism, a revolving door through the prison industrial complex. This has been corroborated by science, facts, and evidence for decades. People have been screaming this at the top of their lungs for decades. And yet, neither party has really done much about it, but the radical end of conservatism in the GOP, which has bastardized the conservative intellectual roots of old-school conservatism in ways that are just undescribable. Stuff that would put William F. Buckley to shame, make him blush, and the intellectual foundings of conservatism are barely followed today by the GOP. They are to conservatism what the Cheesecake Factory is, or Olive Garden is to authentic Italian food, or to what Miley Cyrus and Justin Bieber are to classical music. It is just a absurd notion that the current Republican Party is authentically conservative in any intellectual sense. They've bastardized it and made it into a pop culture word salad of talking points and sound bites and just intellectual, oversimplified garbage that is embarrassing to even have to talk about. That said, there is a serious, well-documented problem with incarceration and poverty, and this does have some relationship to abortions and babies born out of wedlock. You cannot single out one variable, and you cannot solve the entire problem. But if you really care about unborn life, you will look at this scientifically. The best tools we have to deal with this social problem of abortion, this problem of human life, these moral issues are best discussed and understood and sometimes approached with the tools of science, of empirical free inquiry, evidence-based approach and understanding, not through political dogma or ideology or sound bites or talking points or through political extremism. The best tool we have is scientific thinking. The moral issues like abortion should not be exempt from this standard of discussion. And if you really care about human life, they will take this more seriously. And we're supposed to, we look at all the just pockets of backward hypocrisy in our political system. And, the fact that these people put on this facade of puritanical sanctity and correctness when one of our biggest moral failings as a country is our self-delusion and our sense of moral superiority. It actually has deluded us into believing that we are better than we really are. It has lended divine sanction to human dishonesty, where people will lie on stage about how pious they are, about how much they don't cheat on their wife, about how much they love the Bible and their relationship with God, and they'll use these things that appeal to people's deepest moral and spiritual sentiments, and they'll flagrantly lie about them just to get elected. We've enshrined this culture of self-delusion and dishonesty, and taken something that is very personal and sacred, which is people's deepest notions of morality and spirituality and faith, and we've made it into a bastardized political commodity. And this has just become, it is reaching a critical mass in which this pluralistic ignorance will give way to a kind of dissonance where people will start to call bullshit, and they'll see and their neighbors and their neighbors and their neighbors privately know it's bullshit, and we'll start to see this unraveling, and the whole thing will topple, and we'll start to see that honesty and being transparent in our conversations is a much better virtue than this facade of puritanical morality that we've been putting on for centuries, to the detriment of genuine, of genuine human sanity and of genuine morality. So, I mean, this should bother everyone, whether you're faithful, secular, atheist, Christian, doesn't matter. This culture of dishonesty is a threat to the moral sensibilities of all decent Americans, and this is something we need to think about long after this government shutdown, if it happens. And the bottom line is this: if you really want to talk about the Republican Party and how much, and the Democrat Party for that matter, and how much either one cares, let's look at something very important: the Iraq surge of 2007. I was actually past my second deployment, and I was at United States Central Command. And I want to just take this in for a moment about how fundamentally dishonest this idea that the government shutdown is really about doing the right thing, that the Republican Party really gives a damn about unborn babies are about doing what's right, that anyone who believes they're really guided by their convictions, and there might be a few that are, but the idea that en masse, the GOP is guided by a serious desire to weigh the suffering they'll inflict through the shutdown with a deep-seated moral conviction, that they're driven by the state of the deepest values in their hearts. It's just fundamentally absurd, and unravels and falls apart when you look at the way our Congress has functioned over the last decade. So think about this for a second. Congress voted in a strikingly predictable fashion on the 2007 troop surge, one of the most important decisions of my lifetime, important for strategic and humanitarian reasons alike. The basis of this decision was made not from the merits of soldiers' lives or the welfare of the Iraqi people or the stability of the wider region or the possibility of a regional proxy war of political and ethno-religious contests beyond Iraq's borders. No, not at all. The accumulation of political tribalism we see in our Congress at the expense of honor, duty, and human livelihood was incredibly troubling. It was a sobering reflection of the wider problem, and one which has been building up and continues to this day. They voted on the troop surge not based on any of the above principles or any of the above decision factors in their wider moral calculus. Their decisions about war and peace revolve more around partisan lines and what party they belong to than they do about a calculus of human cost or economic cost or benefits and risk. And they voted along party lines with the exception of maybe one or two people when it came to the troop surge. And this shows you where their priorities lie morally. They were willing to vote against their conscience in whether they're for or against it. The way they weighed soldiers' lives and the lives of Iraqis took a back seat to what party they belonged to. And if it was any other way, if even half of them or a third of them were voting based mostly on their conscience, or at least with those factors in mind, then you would see more votes across party lines, just by law of averages, by common sense. But the fact that it was almost neatly split down party lines, being a Democrat or Republican, has nothing to do with the dynamics of the state of Iraq in 2007. At no point when I was doing high-level analysis for multinational forces Iraq is looking at the factors and multi-variables and the correlates of human behavior and Shia-Sunni sectarianism, the ethno-confessional sectarian religious factors at play, which I was essentially analyzing over there, working with different parts of the special operations community, with the multinational forces, the leadership, sometimes going on patrol, sometimes talking about high-level issues that affected the entire country. At no point did being a Democrat or a Republican factor into that. It should not have factored in during the vote. So is as if this basically shows the moral state of destitution that our Congress is at. And essentially, this is something we're going to have to admit to ourselves. We're going to have to admit that this government shutdown is not about honor, it's not about integrity, and it's not about helping the unborn. It's essentially, at its very core, founded on bullshit. It is the self-service of the people in power, and we need people from every direction to scream as loud as they can and stop this from happening. And if it does happen, vote everyone out of power and start from scratch. Even if that won't happen, we should at least aim for it to happen, because we're reaching a critical mass. We're almost at a tipping point. We can no longer afford to entertain this kind of moral insanity within our Congress.